In this, the third chapter of the Indian Economic Development textbook, we're going to be talking about the importance of agriculture. You might be wondering how important agriculture is to the Indian economy, but in the first two chapters, you should have some sensibility about this already. India's economy is highly dependent on agriculture, and agriculture is extremely vital, not only to the economy, but to the society as a whole. Now, there are 8 areas in which the agricultural sector plays a very important role, and we're going to take a closer look at these in this video. The first one is how it contributes to GDP. The second is how it is used as a supply of wage goods. Next, we're going to talk about its impact on employment, followed by how it's used as industrial raw material. Next, its contribution to international trade, then its contribution to domestic trade, followed by how it serves a vital role in this and is central to the transport industry, and finally, how it contributes to the wealth of the nation. So let's take a look at how it contributes to GDP. As you can see by the graph on the left-hand side here, agriculture's contribution to GDP in 1950-51 was enormous. It was 51% of GDP. And as a result of this graph, it looks as though it has fallen off drastically because now it's only worth 14.2% of the GDP. But that's not necessarily true. What you really need to know here and take a close look at and remember is that although there's a reduced percentage contribution of agriculture, this does not imply a reduction in farm production. It only implies relatively greater growth of non-farm production. So in simple terms, actually, what this means is agriculture's level may have stayed put, but the other areas of the economy have started to grow rapidly, so its share of total GDP as a percentage has fallen, but not its gross value. All right, with that said, let's move on. We're going to talk next about how it contributes to wage goods. Now, what are wage goods? Wage goods are the necessities of life. As mentioned in the textbook, they include wheat, rice, pulses, maize, a whole bunch of things. Now, this textbook mentions that the agriculture industry provides these foods and services not only to 1.2 billion people, but also to 510 million animals in India. That's enormous. So its ability to serve virtually 2 billion living beings is where its importance lies. It can serve the needs of 2 billion living things. That's enormous. Next, how does the agricultural industry get involved in the employment process? Well, you probably know from the first 2 chapters, many people in the rural areas work in farms or in rural areas, and they're highly dependent on Indian agriculture. 50% of the population, in fact, is directly or indirectly dependent on it for employment. Next, let's talk about how important the agricultural sector is in terms of raw materials. The agricultural sector provides a variety of raw materials which are then used by the secondary sector to produce final goods. Now, I'm going to give you an example that's not dependent on the agricultural sector per se, but it'll give you a clear image of what we're talking about. So imagine there's a lumberjack. He cuts down a tree, takes the tree, cuts it into small pieces, then he polishes up the wood. He might even sell it as is, but he cuts up the wood, he shaves off all the rough ends, and then he takes that wood and he sells it to a furniture manufacturer. The furniture manufacturer then takes that wood, makes sure it's ready for final prep, and prepares it for use in a table. Now, the table that you're probably sitting in front of right now is probably made of wood. So that wood was a direct input from the farmer or the lumberjack here in this case. So if we think about this in terms of the agricultural sector, rice, wheat, sugar, they're all intermediary products that are used in terms of production of final goods. So the agricultural sector plays a very, very crucial driver for development in the secondary sector. Next, let's move on to the contribution to international trade. India's raw materials and products created a secondary market for goods which are sold overseas. These goods are very, very popular, dependent on where you are. Once these food goods are sold to a given country, they are purchased in a local currency. For instance, if we're selling our goods in the UK, they are purchased in British pounds. If we're selling our goods in America, they are purchased in American dollars. In Japan, the Japanese yen. So, as a result, we can say the production of agricultural products like cotton or wheat or whatever it may be that are sold in foreign markets are actually a direct correlation to the amount of American money or the amount of Japanese yen or the amount of any terms of foreign currency that we're holding. So, as a result, the production of cotton, if sold in America, leads to the direct collection of American dollars. By the same logic, the production of rice sold in Japan leads to a direct collection of Japanese yen. Hence, we often say that agriculture directly impacts the foreign reserves of India. Next, what about its contribution to domestic trade? Well, every single citizen, as we mentioned earlier, is dependent on the agricultural sector for wage goods, and the amount of people was well over 1 billion. So the amount of demand, domestic demand, is astronomical. Next, let's talk about how this is central to the transport industry. Well, as you know, goods aren't always consumed where they are produced. For instance, my television may have been made in China, but I'm watching it now in Japan. My PC may also have been produced in China, but I'm not using it in China. By the same logic, agricultural goods productions in the rural areas of India are not consumed only in the rural areas, they're consumed primarily in the urban areas. So to get it from point A to point B, we are highly dependent on the railway sector. But that also means the railway sector is highly dependent on the production of agricultural goods. Now, the last aspect here is the wealth of the nation. Well, a significant amount of wealth for India is dependent on the agricultural sector. In 1950 and 51% of GDP was directly from agriculture. Today, it is 14.2%, as we mentioned in the first slide. But that 14.2% translates into millions and millions and millions of dollars, quite likely billions of dollars. And millions more is spent on converting those goods into secondary sector goods. So the aspect of how important the wealth of the nation is and how dependent it is on agriculture, there is no other word to describe this other than extremely important. So, in conclusion, in summary, what do we have here? We realize that from this sector, agriculture is very, very important for India in terms of wage goods, an important source of procuring foreign exchange. It helps act as a source for secondary sector production, and it is a significant contributor to the wealth of the nation and helps millions of people survive.